Dr. Henry Marsh, a British neurosurgeon, was displeased when the UK Parliament rejected euthanasia 4 years ago. The good doctor said, quote, "Even if a few grannies get bullied into suicide, isn't that the price worth paying for all the people who could die with dignity?" he asked. We should give some more thoughts to those grannies. Our head of state certainly did back in 1995, when euthanasia was last a national issue in Australia. Governor-General at the time, Bill Hayden, was explaining to doctors on the Gold Coast why he supported euthanasia, not only as a right, but also as a positive duty to society. Quote, "There is a point when the succeeding generations deserve to be disencumbered of some unproductive burdens." End quote. This firm message to society's unproductive burdens was supported the next day by a former state governor, Sir Mark Oliphant. He told ABC Radio about an aged colleague in Canberra who, quote, "should be dead and was cluttering up the world when he shouldn't be." Governor-General Hayden told his audience about past cultures where the grannies and granddads would take poison or wander off into the forests when their usefulness to society was done. The elderly Japanese, he said, defined as such by loss of all teeth, would jump from the rim of a volcano for the greater good. But this is the point. Did that toothless Japanese granny jump, or was she pushed? More subtly, did she indeed jump, but only because of an irresistible cultural push? That is the insidious new oppression of euthanasia, the oppression we do not need to have. The lonely old people that I see in nursing homes already have a keen sense of being a burden. They would perceive euthanasia less as a right to die and more as a duty to die. They would get the message, but they are no longer welcome, and they would do the right thing by society. Consider an elderly, now deceased patient of mine, a woman with minimal self-confidence and depression, who received a vicious letter from a close relative effectively telling her she should be dead and demanding certain arrangements in her will. She then developed cancer. Now, what would the right to die mean to such a patient, so isolated and intimidated? Now for its proponents, death on demand would indeed enlarge their autonomy. But given the psychological vulnerability of the average old person, the sense they already have of being unproductive burdens, and the power of insensitive family or medical staff to reinforce this sense, such a decision will be made from a position of humiliation and weakness. Former Prime Minister Paul Keating agreed in 2017, writing this, quote, "It is fatuous to assert that patients will not feel under pressure once this bill becomes law to nominate themselves for termination." End quote. And the Australian Medical Association president at the time, Dr. Michael Gannon, cautioned this. He said, "The sick, the elderly, the disabled, the chronically ill and the dying must never be made to feel that they are a burden." End quote. Hence the AMA's formal reaffirmation as recently as 2016, quote, "Doctors should not be involved in interventions that have as their primary intention the ending of a person's life." End quote. Power corrupts, and the doctor-patient relationship will be corrupted by the power to take life. In Holland, where euthanasia is legal, doctors have unlawfully put to death several hundred patients each and every year without their consent. In neighbouring Belgium, the circle of criteria for euthanasia has steadily expanded from adults to children, from the terminally ill to those simply tired of life, from cases of depression and chronic fatigue to those distressed by anorexia, even a 41-year-old man who so regretted his sex change operation that he wanted to die, and the Belgian doctors obliged. Paul Keating sees this slipperiest of slopes as entirely predictable. He writes, "Once termination of life is authorised, the threshold is crossed. From that point, it is much easier to liberalise the conditions governing the law, and liberalised they will be," he said. Indeed they will be, for if we enshrine in law this right to die, then who are you to restrict that right? Now, the plan B for society is to reject the corruption of euthanasia, uphold that prohibition on intentional killing as the cornerstone of law, and strive to improve palliative care, that powerful field of medicine that offers for the first time in history the prospect of a tolerable death for all of us in this lucky country. But importantly, rejection of euthanasia is not dependent on perfecting palliative care for all patients. Nor is its rejection a religious issue. Its rejection stands on the rock-solid ground of social justice. As the Honourable Kevin Andrews explained on presenting his Euthanasia Laws Bill in 1996, he said this: "The people who are most at risk are the most vulnerable, and a law which fails to protect vulnerable people will always be a bad law." End quote. For if we open the door to euthanasia, society would not, no matter what Andrew Denton says, go gentle into that good night. It would go brutal as a culture which chooses to make people dead rather than care for them in dying, whose unproductive burdens will freely jump to their death, but only because of this insidious cultural push.